gratitude for our teachers, former, past, and present. And I got a email last night from a very pleased client, and it just kind of reminded me that, you know, first and foremost, maybe my first gratitude should be for each one of you all, and what you do every day in giving to and serving your clients. You know, the email I got from a very happy client yesterday was actually talking about Scott Ween in the Metro North office. I don't even know if Scott's on this call or not, and I'm not trying to embarrass him or call him out, but it was a great letter, really symbolic of so many things that you guys do and really could be written about any one of you. You know, a couple of highlights. The buyer talks about his wife and he wanting to retire to this area and renting in the marketplace for 2 years until they met Scott at an open house. And again, lots of people in our market coming in, thinking about moving here long-term and buying, you know, many years after moving here. But open houses are a great opportunity, but only if you're able to connect with the client in a real and sincere way at those open houses. The client goes on to say, I appreciate the fact that Scott was a retired Marine, and that also told me that his dedication would be genuine. And I think we've always talked about, you know, that genuineness is going to trump anything else in our world over, you know, data or can I sell you this or can't I push you into that? You know, if someone knows you're genuine, you're much more likely to keep them as a longtime client. Scott always found the time to discuss and answer all of my questions. His real estate advice has always made sense to both of us, and we appreciate his extra effort in all of our real estate matters. Again, you know, listing the house, and there are formalities that need to be done to put a house on the market and in MLS and certain things, but that real estate expertise is really what sets you apart from part-time agents or somebody doing it as a hobby, or somebody who might be able to also put a house in MLS in a tight market. That expertise can't be matched. And he concludes by, despite me calling him even on the weekends, he always answered the phone. Kind of the first step, sometimes simple, but often overlooked. And I could tell he did not mind the phone call. Again, being genuine and giving people time to be heard and listen to them. If he didn't answer, he promised to call me back. Again, not faking to have the answers to everything, but it's okay to tell someone I don't know, but I'll get back to you with that information. With real estate professionals like Scott, it's no wonder your firm is one of the top companies in the area for real estate sales. So again, that's a great testimonial to Scott, and want my gratitude obviously to go to each of you guys. Couple of quick things. COVID update. Obviously everybody's seen numbers going up in various places, including in South Carolina. The good thing is hopefully we've seen some of the death rates go down, and some of the illness go down. So still something we've got to manage and watch. At least if we've got one indicator going in the wrong direction, we have some indicators going in the right direction. So hopefully we get a handle on both of those. I do appreciate everybody's cooperation, understanding, and participation in our mask in common areas policy. It just really makes sense. And again, if not for yourself, remember, you know, that person next to you might be going home to an elderly parent or grandparent or spouse, and we want to make sure they're protected as well. Looking a little bit at the market, I wanted to, right before we get to our guest, wanted to kind of, you know, look at kind of where we were 6 or 7 months ago and where we are now. And I think in both the real estate discussion and in the broader discussion that we want to have with Eddy, you know, I looked up the definition of the word crisis, and a crisis was defined as both a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger, as well as a time when difficult or important decisions must be made. And I think coronavirus, prior to some of the inequality and other issues that we've been dealing with as a society, certainly qualify as crises. But I think it's also important, as we focus, you know, the beginning of this on a little bit of a market update, to realize what crises might be short-term and what might be, as we talk about some of the societal issues out there, what might be a lot more long-term. You're looking at the beginning of 2020. You know, I put out a memo both to the company and the Visimill articles and even to the public talking about 2020 was going to be the best year ever for real estate. You know, we carried a lot of momentum from 2019. We had low interest rates, nearing historic lows again, approaching 4%. Interest rates that low increased affordability, even though prices kept going up. Active inventory was a reasonable level, so we didn't have too many houses on the market for sale. And new homes were coming on and price appreciation was reasonable. All of those things still exist today. In fact, interest rates are even lower, so affordability is increased. And while we've got some challenges with employment on the longer term, all of those things exist. So we've got some short-term economic market conditions that we're going to adjust to over the next 3, 6, 9 months. But the Charleston housing market is very strong. And, you know, I'm hoping that COVID, again, even if we're talking about a year, and I know there are real impacts on real people and businesses that have closed and people that have lost their jobs. But, you know, relatively speaking, like a hurricane or like other issues, it will hopefully be a short-term crisis. Last week, we'll probably, I haven't seen any final numbers, but clock in as a 10th week in a row of record sales. 2 weeks ago, we got close to the all-time high in weekly sales. Prior to this last 10-week run, the busiest week in Charleston history had been about 458 pended sales. And we've beaten that, it looks like, the last 10 weeks in a row. The market is up 7% year to date in written sales over last year. So certainly mid-March and April, I was throwing away my plans for 2020 being the best year ever, and told John to throw away our budget for a 5% increase in closed sales. And those plans are actually back alive, thanks to all of the efforts of you guys in serving your clients through very difficult circumstances. In June, you all collectively, because no one here at Salt Point, and certainly not me, is going to sell a single house. You here collectively sold 1,148 houses for over $435 million in volume. So that's a gargantuan effort. It was up 40% over activity last June, and probably beat the MLS greater market by about 3%. The greater market was up somewhere between 35 and 37%. So you all are outperforming the market and finding ways to serve your clients even in difficult and trying times. But inventory continues to shrink. Good listings are certainly selling fast. And while the formal activity contest has ended, and we'll have some final results and exciting announcements for your offices, and excited to hear about the charitable causes that you all choose to support in each of your individual offices, those activities are still as important today as they were when we were in active contests. Those are the activities that will start your day off right, expressing your gratitude, writing your personal notes, doing all of the Ninja 9 that will lead to long-term success if we focus on the client and what's in their best interest over the long term, not focusing, if you were on Monday morning's Java with Johns, not focusing just on that deal, but focusing on the benefit you're providing, and then looking to the side and realizing that providing those sorts of benefits and service result in the activity that help you not only have a better business, but a better life as well. But as we talked about 2 weeks ago, you know, there are, you know, it's weird that they all kind of came to the forefront maybe at the same time or not at the same time, or at least during some of the pandemic things. But when we talk about what hopefully will be a short-term economic crisis caused by COVID with some obviously real impacts on real people, you know, some of the other issues of inequality and injustice and other things that have been brought to the forefront of our society certainly qualify as a lot more than short-term crisis, things that have been prevalent in our society for decades and hundreds of years. And Eddy Moratin is both a personal friend and colleague of Patty and I met Eddy and had the opportunity to meet Eddy through the Path North organization. And Eddy has always had a passion for encouraging others to realize their full potential and use their individual gifts for the betterment of the whole community. And he lives in Orlando, Florida, working with Lift Orlando, that he'll talk a little bit about as well, with his wife Giselle and their two children, Isabella and Christopher. But you know, Eddy and I had a conversation on Friday, you know, talking a little bit about taking some time to examine, you know, the history of real estate, the history of maybe how real estate got set up, and trying to, in the context of what we do in this world, examine a few of these issues, maybe from a different side. And what I told Eddy, my goal for today really was that if everybody left just thinking about something a different way, or looking internally and externally a little deeper, then I would certainly be very pleased. And I don't think there's anybody better kind of to lead that discussion than Eddy. So Eddy, I'll kind of turn it over to you, and I think you're maybe going to go through some historical issues that kind of put a few things in perspective. Hopefully Les has Eddy unmuted, or Eddy can unmute himself.
How about that? Can you hear me now?
I can.
Oh, wonderful. Michael, thank you so much. You're really kind, and thank you for the invitation to join you all. It's really neat to get a glimpse into the culture of this great company. I hear so many great things about all of you. I love that you've been having these conversations and that you would welcome just taking a step back. I feel like today it's really hard to cut through the noise. If you're a thoughtful person and you want to like try to really understand what's going on, it's hard to do that with the steady stream of the sort of biased information we get from any angle. And so for me, oftentimes it's helpful just to zoom out a little bit to see things in context. And I do that with the intention of figuring out, I believe one of the main reasons for knowing our history is to know how to hack the future, right? That the history not only repeats itself, but it shows us how we got to where we are. And it helps us kind of undo, deconstruct, and then build things that could then connect to the original purpose. If we might have gotten any piece wrong in the process. It's like if you take your car to the mechanic and he immediately just assumes what you need done without actually ever troubleshooting, without actually ever testing out whether all the systems are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we've all had that experience at one point or another. Either we or others have been too quick to say, this is what needs to be done, without just spending the time to seek deeper understanding. So I think what Michael, you're referring to, we had a great conversation where sort of that came up. And I also, just my experience in real estate has been minimally at a personal level in the individual single family home sort of rental world. We've done mostly stuff in the commercial world, in the co-working space, call center world of commercial real estate. But I have a soft spot for America's connection. Part of the big idea that made us such an incredible country, besides the notion of just deciding that we could be a nation, when up until the invention of America, the only way you become a nation is through a familial line. You look at Europe and other nations, people are related, and there's enough of them to eventually start a clan and ultimately a nation. And we decide to throw out that convention and say, like, if you want to call America home, you are an American. There's no need for a bloodline to prove that. And that invention of saying, like, we're going to declare ourselves a sovereign nation, and in this nation, everything does not belong to the king. Everything does not belong to just the few landed gentry, but the idea of coming up with ways where this is a place that would belong to everybody. And the granting of land, the opportunity to own, to enter the ownership class. I mean, this is a revolutionary idea. And so the world is real estate as we know it today. It's so commonplace. We swim in it. We don't fully value all the time how incredibly unique it is. But from the very first incentives to get people to come here, giving 50 acres of land if you were willing to work it, to land ordinances that granted people the ability all the way up into this last century, from the 1700s to begin with, to say, like, if you can buy over 600 acres at $1 an acre, if you're willing to work it for however many years. And that came oftentimes with grants for schoolhouses, for free education, and this vision of a nation made up of people who owned that nation. And with that ownership came a sense of responsibility for its well-being. Was done here more than anywhere else in the world. The very notion of the American dream in its purest sense, right? Not the materialistic ambition of simple accumulation, but the more spiritual ambition of leaving the world better off for your children than how you found it. Your kids having a better starting point than you did. That's one it resonates for all of us. That may be the greatest invention in history. When you consider that we've taken wave upon wave of mostly illiterate immigrants in our nation's history and turned it into the wealthiest nation in the world. We're seeing the largest transfer of wealth to ever happen in world history happen right now, largely due to what was invented here. And so I do, in our work, we do our urban revitalization work. So we're in the shadows of downtown, working in a community historically distressed for a number of reasons. And we came to that work because a lot of us in the business community downtown starting to realize that as philanthropic as individuals and corporations might be, Orlando was still ranking pretty low for the well-being of most vulnerable families. And as we began to explore opportunities that tied together with the redevelopment of a new stadium back in 2012, our city announced we were going to have a new Citrus Bowl, $200+ million, but we didn't even have a football team. So we're like, what exactly are we doing? But the organization, the nonprofit that runs that stadium for 70 years, has been using events, football games, concerts, to raise dollars for charity. But they themselves were also saying, man, I feel like we're writing checks to the Four Winds to support charities, don't seem to be moving the needle. What if we could just figure out how to be the first football stadium that's good for the neighborhood it's in? And so for most of these CEOs and major employers in town, we began regular meetings to try to study what it would look like to grow downtown in a way that was more inclusive, that created opportunities for everybody, and looked across the railroad tracks as a world that was part of the world we cared about in meaningful ways. And, first we're watching the nightly news and we're thinking like, well, gosh, that's awful. We got to do something about the crime. That's the problem. And then we toured the elementary school for the first time and learned that the turnover in the third grade classroom was 100%. And we went from the first aha of like, oh, maybe crime is a symptom and education is the root cause, to realizing, wait a minute, if the neighborhood is so unstable, you can't barely educate these children in sustainable ways because mom is living in a terrible place, is moving around to the next move-in special every 6 months because she doesn't have a better job, because she doesn't have an education, has a mountain of health challenges. All these things were connected. So we started Lift Orlando and this organization to really holistically embrace the neighborhood, invest in people, place, and partnership. But as we started to peel back, because we're always obsessed with root causes and we don't want to be focused on symptoms, but on systems and the root causes of how we got here, the housing story of our country became really fascinating because besides the early innovations at the founding of our nation, there's the sort of the tale of the two FHAs, as I call them, the original Fair Housing Authority in 1934 really transformed the landscape of our country in almost equally revolutionary ways. Before then, you had to have most of the value of a home to buy it. And this, for the very first time, allowed you to provide a small down payment and have a 30-year government-insured mortgage to allow you to buy a home. And this is so commonplace and known for us, we don't think twice about it. But at the time, it was absolutely world-changing. It opened up home ownership and real shot at wealth creation for millions of Americans in ways that were not available before. But it was also a fork in the road. You have an opportunity to do that for every American. And who knows what the US would be like today. But we decided at that time that if you were Black or Jewish, that was not going to apply to you. That we would not insure developments for developers who allowed people of color, that you had to agree to come under the nomenclature of white, even though at that time, most what we would call white and European descendants living in major cities, the Irish and the Italians and the Germans and the Polish didn't get along that well. But if you were willing to put that aside and come to this new phenomena called suburbia and wear the label of white, you could be included. And anyone who did not fit that would not be included. And even for the GIs, for soldiers who just literally saved the world. The greatest generation ever found themselves coming back to not be included in those invitations in either the GI Bill and home ownership opportunities and the wave of events that occurred after. Now, I share that history, and I'll keep it short, but the goal of sharing history for me, again, is not to layer guilt. It's not to unleash rage. It's not to stir up emotions in any way. If anything, it's to just help us understand the mechanisms for how we get here. And today, there are way too many voices stirring up emotions, and there are reasons and beneficial objectives sometimes to the people doing that. But then there's also those of us who just want to understand how, if we've not built communities in ways that are ideal for all, how can we understand lessons from our past that help us build communities that are shared communities of opportunity and upward mobility for everyone? Your industry, your space is a cornerstone space. For us, transforming what we've seen in this community started with understanding the role of real estate and building highest quality, award-worthy and winning real estate developments that also were inclusive to create shared communities for everyone. That's probably more than you wanted me to share there, Michael, but the history of it all is a subject of passion for me.
No, I think it's critical to the discussion. I'll go back one, and you and I had a chance to catch up on Friday, but I assume everyone's doing well down in Orlando.
Yeah, thank you. Thank goodness. Even with everything going on, even though it's scary to even come to Florida, I've had friends receive judgment from northerner friends over the thought of coming to Florida. But yeah, thank goodness everyone's well in our circle.
But I think the history is important because, you know, as you said, the way in which some of the systems that have provided unimaginable wealth were set up are important to look at and examine as we move forward. And we've talked about that, you know, the net worth of a homeowner is 41 times greater than that of a renter. And I've always talked about, for my family, for my, you know, entire life, you know, my mother got in real estate in the late 70s when I was a young child, that we are so very blessed to be able to make our living in real estate and help people build that kind of wealth. Because as you said, what builds that kind of wealth, and the reason the homeowner has 41 times the net worth of a renter, is the ability with a small down payment to purchase a home, and, you know, to have that fixed payment for 30 years, and at the end of 30 years to have a home that's worth 3 times what you paid for it, and a mortgage payment at that time that's pretty small. At the same time, and, you know, Eddie, I'll kind of, you know, put this question to you, you know, African American homeownership rate is 30 points lower than the white homeownership rate. So 72.2% for non-Hispanic whites and 41.7% in the African American community. And when you have a disparity in home ownership, which is the largest wealth creation tool in our country, it begs the question of, you know, how do we approach that difference? And, you know, what do we do to, you know, not only be aware, but start to, you know, chip away at some of those differences?
You know, it's, yeah, there's so much good stuff to chew on there, because I'm particularly passionate about the role of the real estate industry and real estate leaders and real estate developers and people who understand the way real estate works, because it's how we build communities in the most literal sense. And when you understand its role as a mechanism for engaging the economic engine in cities, it puts you in a very central position to the narrative of how your community grows. And it's a good reminder for each of you. There's such a great sense of importance to your contribution in your community. And so I'll say today, I think offer first a frame for thinking about it, and then sort of a direct answer at a tactical level to your question. When right as the Civil War was wrapping up, it was clear the North was winning, and Lincoln's representative, the general, Marshall, no, I'm getting his name wrong, but he was meeting with recently freed slaves. And he asked them, hey, this is like literally a blank check from the President of the United States. We're acknowledging this nation has done you wrong, injustice has occurred. What do you want? And what do they ask for? I mean, they could ask for anything they want. They could ask for retribution, for revenge on their captors. They could ask for financial recompense. All they say is that just give us land. You let us own. We see what you've built here and the great opportunity this country is. Just give us a piece of it. Let us own a piece of it, and we will build the futures we want for our country, for our families. And that idea of just getting a piece of the pie, of connecting to that. In a growing city, the function of all the systems that interplay in a community operates almost like an economic engine. If you're plugged into it, it drives your prosperity. And the way you plug into that is a social context that you're in that connects you to opportunities, to knowledge, know-how, and the financial mechanisms that make that city work. The neighborhood you live in is the prime. It's like if the city is an upward escalator that moves people up in prosperity, your neighborhood, your social contacts and financial connection to the physical assets in the city plug you in to the economic escalator, the cycle of prosperity that cities and communities create. With that knowledge, the opportunity to get people connected to the ownership class and to neighborhoods where there is not only physical ownership and assets, but actually social capital and connection to opportunities. So it's been said and proven through research that no matter how poor a child is born, that if they can just do 4 things, they're guaranteed to join the middle class in their lifetime. If they can graduate from high school, go to college, land a job, and then start a family. Having those 4 events occur in that order will almost assure them to join the middle class. The challenge is if you are living in a community where the basic institutions that form the possibility of making those choices make it the kind of place where there's not only a lot of bad choices being made, but in reality, there's a lot of poor options to choose from. The odds of the average, especially Black boys in our country today, statistically speaking, of simply doing those 4 things, graduating from high school, going to college, landing a job, starting a healthy family in that order, are the statistical equivalent of that child having determination, focus, and putting in the hard work over 12 or 20 years. They need a good teacher or 2, a positive mentor, role model, a praying grandmother, maybe 2. Meanwhile, in our zip code where we work in downtown Orlando, if you cross the street to the north, you're in a different zip code where quite predictably, there we have the College Park neighborhood, the Country Club of Orlando. Most children will graduate from high school, go to college, land a job, start a healthy family. No superhuman effort required, no savior mentors. That's just the average potentiality and predictable outcome. Are there outliers? Absolutely. It's still America. People are free to screw up their life wherever they live, whenever they want to. And are there children who make it from the roughest circumstances and neighborhoods? Absolutely, they do. But oftentimes we look at them and we think of their anecdotal examples as evidence that everybody else there should be able to do it just as easily, when in reality, they're a statistical anomaly. They're an outlier. They're a little bit of a miracle. So what we're talking about is less I believe deeply in individual responsibility, that we are held responsible for the choices that we make and the lives that we shape instead. But understanding the role of building community says you're trying to change the predictable outcomes for the average person in that population. How do you change the possibilities, the available options for them? So for us, it's definitely about inviting people to just have access to the same opportunities. The benefit of understanding real estate, and the reason why one of my mentors and the author of a great book, Toxic Charity, it's a small little book, highly recommend it. It really makes you rethink, if you're a generous person at all, what you're doing with your money and what you give to. And basically what he tries to steer people away from is initiatives that further dependency towards approaches, sometimes to the same initiatives, that can increase independence and people's self-sufficiency and connection to community, the kind of skills that help them be more successful and provide for their own. But early on in our work, we brought him down to speak to our group, and our board and founding cohort are mostly bankers, real estate people, developers, but all of us were kind of feeling like we were stepping way outside of our comfort zone to talk about these complex social issues. And he said to the group something that stuck with us. He said two things that were really unexpected. One, he said that he believed that the missionaries of the future were all real estate developers, to which the room erupted in laughter. And he said, I know most of you feel like, you sit in the back pew if you go to church, and you spend most of the time thinking about the next deal. And as soon as that one's close to wrapping up, you're thinking about the next two deals. And nothing about that feels very spiritual, but that is exactly the skill set most needed today if you're going to redeem the very problems created by those skills in the past. The second thing he said was that he realized in 30 years of doing world-class revitalization work in inner city Atlanta, way before it was a cool thing to do, was that what the poor need most is not more programs and services. Often have too many of those. What the poor need most is a caring and connected neighbor. And here's the example he gave. He was trying to come up with an employment program to help in a neighborhood, largely a community of color, for people to get better jobs, make more money, provide for their families. And so he spent months researching program partners and providers and how to design this program. In the meantime, in his own home, his son says to him, hey, Dad, I want to start working. And so that Sunday, he sees a friend at church who happens to run HR at the local zoo. And he says, hey, my son's looking for a job. I'm not asking for any favors, but just wondering if I can have him just give you a call sometime. And she's like, yeah, sure, have him call me. The next week, kid calls. Within a few days, he's been hired to work at the zoo. Now, they live in this inner city neighborhood, so he's out around the corner playing basketball with his friends as usual. And he says that he can't come back tomorrow because he's got a new job. And they're like, wait a minute, you got a job? I need a job. While his dad is still researching employment and placement programs, in a matter of a few short days, he got 5 young men in the neighborhood employed at the zoo. Because what they had was not a program, they had a contact with a caring person who was connected outside of their world. And so there are 2 essential things. One is finding opportunities for folks to have access to the great quality communities available, to own, to live in, to be connected in communities, to create more mixed income opportunities for folks. When we committed to one of our goals, developing mixed income neighborhoods, I did have people look at me. I honestly had someone say to me, like, how the heck are you going to get higher income families to want to live next door to those people? And I don't know what I said in that conversation, but I remember shortly after calling who became eventually our joint venture partner in our first development. We've won multiple awards for Pindana at Westlakes is the name of this multifamily development in that case. And he'd been doing this for years. Noel Khalil was his name, and all their properties are just stunning world-class developments. And I said, no, you must have run into that before. What do you say to people who look at you about the subject of mixing incomes? And he laughed and he said, look, our mission is, as he put it, is to build cathedrals for God's people. We want to provide housing for good people at all income levels. And by that, what I mean is you can mix incomes all day long. What you can never mix are values. And the values of wanting to live in a quiet, clean community where your kids can run safely and you respect other people's property, that actually transcends income levels. In fact, there are plenty of people making a lot of money you would never want to have as next door neighbors. And this idea that used to actually be more prevalent in America, that across the spectrum of incomes, people could live in the same neighborhood. You may not have been the wealthy family in your neighborhood, but you knew the family in the big house on the corner that owned the hardware store, or you knew people who had more opportunity or more education. And that context opened up doors of opportunity, or at least exposure of possibility. So for us, to answer your question, Michael, we believe that it's finding ways to reintegrate our communities from a socioeconomic perspective. Because today, because of the long history in our country that has disadvantaged so many in communities of color, we have really cordoned off Black families into certain neighborhoods. Then we've choked off those neighborhoods from investments, from access to capital, from opportunities. We've disinvested in those schools and in those physical assets. And over time, what is true now is there's almost a direct overlap between poor communities and communities of color. Find the poorest neighborhood in your city, and you will find that it is largely a community of color in most cases. That is not by accident. It's not that many people just chose to live in the worst part of town by choice because they like that somehow. When you start to understand that and just embrace it with a real sense of realism, finding opportunities for good people. If you want to be trouble and you're up to the wrong things, you need to end up in the hands of justice. You need to not have access to the right opportunities. But there are plenty of folks who don't make a lot of money, who are just good, decent people trying to work hard, provide for their families, build brighter futures. And we make it harder for them sometimes because we make assumptions by the color of their skin or what they look like, or because they don't come in a pretty wrapper. And building more communities where folks at all levels that are beautiful enough and amenity rich enough, people of any income would want to live there, but finding affordable access and opportunities for folks to be next door, people will build their own pathways out of poverty more, better, and faster than any program can do. So I'll pause there because you let me get on my soapbox a little bit, but the point is that look for the lowest income parts in your city, and opportunities to see high quality developments there occur helps the problem. And then building affordable but high quality developments in other parts of the city are super important.
No, I actually, I think I told you before, I could listen to you be on your soapbox for any number of hours.
Careful what you wish for.
So I appreciate you sharing that with us. You know, I got a couple of questions, you know, in the 15 or so minutes that we have left. You know, you and I were talking on Friday, and I use the example, and I'm going to turn it over to you for the bigger context of really, you know, what can someone do, and how do we do things different in our daily lives, as you were just kind of talking about. You know, when I sent out the company memo, you know, an interesting response I got from actually the son of an agent. And again, we're not gonna, you know, change the world overnight, but his response was, you know, I bought some houses in largely African American communities to renovate and sell. And he said, you know, my mindset was, well, this will be a great rental for somebody, and so I'll look for an investor who can buy it and basically rent it back to somebody in the community. And I think sometimes people think their economic issues and their social issues have to diverge from one another. And the email he said was, you know, now maybe I should look for somebody in that community to buy it. It may be at the same price. He doesn't have to take a financial loss, or maybe the numbers are slightly different, but maybe, which is perfectly fine with fair housing. We're not going to discriminate between black, green, white, or brown people. That's not what I'm saying. But, you know, if he is flipping houses and he waits an extra day or two to see if there's an owner occupant that wants to buy that house and is qualified to buy that house, and, you know, maybe the process isn't as clean or as simple. Maybe we've got to go through the Palmetto Heroes program for a down payment assistance grant, or maybe it's going to take a little longer than the guy who wants to pay cash and close in 2 weeks. But if that neighborhood has one more owner occupant versus one more investor, and the economics work okay for the guy who renovated and wants to make a reasonable profit on his investment, and there's nothing wrong with that, then if we all looked at those things and did a little bit different, you know, what do our communities look like? And so, you know, I want to leave, we're not done yet, but, you know, I want people to be able to think about, you know, what can they do, and how do we look at those things kind of in a broader context and not just black and white?
Yeah, thank you. So I love that example because I agree 100%. I think the point that you're also making is that doing right by those who are most vulnerable and having a successful career or operating a profitable business are not mutually exclusive ideas. The contrary is actually true, that the rewards that come from knowing that you've tried to stand by what's right and from building a reputation of being that kind of a person are far greater than the financial reward and often fuel more financial reward. History is full of those examples. And so I love that encouragement. I do. So to think most practically, right, about actionable ways to apply the to respond to the times that we're in and whatever wisdom we can glean. One, I just want to encourage the word responsibility. In that particular case, that gentleman took the opportunity at hand, and instead of I'm going to do what I always do, taking responsibility, say like, well, what can I do a little differently? How do I mentioned our joint venture partner, Columbia Residential, they're a for-profit business. They could make a lot more money doing strictly affordable, low quality housing and depending on every public subsidy to pull that off and have a much simpler business proposition and an operation. Or they are good enough at what they do, they could be very successful doing regular market rate in other neighborhoods and there's, man, the demand in Orlando is so insane, it would be nonstop. Same thing for Georgia. But they've chosen to do this somewhat harder and more complicated work of building stuff that is still high quality, beautiful, award winning, and affordable, accessible for a significant number of those units, which means jumping through a lot more hoops, going through a lot more complication, having a much more complex financial stack. But it's the sacrifice to be made by those who have the power, the ability to do it, is not to lower your standards. It's not to compromise on your purpose, mission, objective, or profit, but it is to say, like, I might leave a little on the table. I might make this a little harder on myself. I might be more patient in my search when you're trying to hire people or engage someone in a contractual relationship. Don't lessen your standard of quality or expectation of what you want people to perform at, but you might have to take a little longer to fill that role or to partner with the right person if you want to create opportunities in minority communities. And so being willing to say, I'm going to take on some brunt of the extra willpower, the extra thought, the extra money, the extra effort to make this a more equitable opportunity, because I want to be a force that is the opposite of the force that has held people back for so long. I want to know that I'm connected to the solution. There is a lot of that very institutional, legally mandated and regulated form of racism and injustice that was instituted in the original Federal Housing Authority was legally undone with the Fair Housing Act in the 60s. But there is very robust documentation of persistent discrimination in the real estate industry well into the 90s, and even today, minorities report having a much greater likelihood of poor financing instruments, worse deals and outcomes with often the same credit history and background on paper as a different applicant. And those realities, when we own them, just take responsibility, not in an issuance of guilt or a weight that creates shame, but in of saying like, I'm not going to let that happen. I'm going to be extra vigilant about that stuff. I'm not going to lessen standards, but I'm going to make sure that I'm going to watch myself. Like, I had to encourage a friend of the day who kept mentioning to me, in the midst of all things, a very known and influential leader in our community, and felt the need to say in a conversation, well, I'm not a racist, on his way to making another point. And I lovingly wanted to clarify for him the issue of race, the practice of racism, the ideas about race, so popularized in our culture, so repeated in the streams of information, of sources of influence, and throughout our history, voices of faith, of science, of culture, of intellectual communities have reinforced it for so long that all of us, there's not a one of us, I don't care what your color is, I don't care how you treat it, to some degree, the way we view other people has been affected by the lens of our culture. And there's some aspect, some tendency to make judgment calls in an instant. Even an African-American woman will clench her purse tighter if a young Black man with, you know, dreads and droopy pants comes walking on the other side of the sidewalk. There's some of that is human nature, but sometimes it's more subtle than that. Sometimes just assuming what someone's capable of, what they can afford, or what they would like, or where they would fit in, and just take responsibility over the fact that those tendencies are very insidious. They operate often at a very subconscious level, and say, you know what, I'm just going to be aware of that in myself and be a force for good in those moments. Again, I do believe in the importance of individual responsibility as a central tenet of what makes all of us better versions of ourselves. And at this moment in time, a lot of what our struggle is the inability by some to say, hey, I may not have done that, I may not have been there, I may not have owned people, but I can take responsibility over how I'm going to respond in this moment. And of others to say, because I see myself or relate to the posture of the victim in that narrative, it's your job and other people's jobs to fix the situation. Listen, we're not getting out of this until all of us take responsibility. We have to sit at the table together and say, if I'm alive at this moment, however we got here, whoever made the mess, I want to take responsibility for doing my part to clean up the mess. And I have found, I'm a firstborn, and so it's one of the first lessons in leadership I learned was that it's my fault. Doesn't matter who did it. And from a leadership perspective, it served me well to never allow myself to be disempowered in a situation by not being willing to take responsibility. So that would be just a practical encouragement in every situation you're in. You can take responsibility somehow to be part of the solution, to be part of a force for good.
And I think, like you said, as we address some of those issues long term, then you start to see, a picture of the world that might more accurately reflect the world. This call is going to be underrepresented by African American agents, based upon the population of our community. At the same point, when you have the African American community with 30% less home ownership than the white community, you're going to end up with, guess what? Less African American agents. Yeah. And that doesn't, it's not that African American agents are only going to serve African American buyers and sellers, but when that community doesn't see home ownership as a future path, then it ends up in lower representation than what we should have. And then that ends up with less African American brokers and less African American real estate company owners and so forth. And so I think those are some of the challenges that we have to address. As you said, it may not be as easy. We have, no cost credit repair services through our mortgage company. And it may not be as easy to have somebody say, hey, why don't we, talk with them so we can see if over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, you can be qualified to buy a home. Again, not so that we can sell more houses and make more money. Yes, that's the business we're in, but so that 10 years from now, they're paying the same 30-year mortgage payment they are now, instead of paying a higher percentage of their income towards rent and rent at a rate that's escalating faster than their wages are. And so all of a sudden, a greater and greater and greater percentage of income goes to pay for housing, and a smaller and smaller and smaller percentage goes to pay for everything else. We've sent out and hope everybody has educated themselves. And again, these aren't just issues of black or brown or white. These are issues of how does real estate provide a economic ladder for all people. But we have sent out the information on the Palmetto Heroes program. Again, down payment assistance for first responders, and now extended to grocery store workers and delivery drivers and people on the front line during COVID. How can this crisis provide a greater opportunity for one or two people to think that home ownership might be something in my wheelhouse? Eddy, as we wrap up, I wanted to ask you I had one agent, Beth, ask about what steps are there for developers who might be interested in thinking about development a slightly different way, but also, you know, had somebody else ask a question about Lift Orlando, and you know, as far as, is that a public-private partnership, and how does that work? Because I like, obviously, as what you said, it's not a city housing project, which, as you said, cities have gotten wrong for so many years. It's really as much a empowerment zone that everybody's going to want to live regardless of your race or your economic status, which makes it so much more powerful. But, you know, if somebody, how do you, you know, if you want to talk just a little bit more about that program, and then if somebody was a developer or knows a developer or is looking at those things, how do they maybe look at things a little different, or are there resources out there that you would recommend?
Particularly for someone who's a developer, I really want you to hear this, because there's a very central role that you can play, because you already understand, even in the development of any project now, that you can't do that project alone. You play a very central role there, but there's so many trades and skill sets that accomplish that. And that's the mindset that is required for doing this. It is the cities, it is private industry, it is philanthropy, it is individuals, corporations, it is all of the above. And so for us, that collaboration has been key. We think of what we do as trying to reverse the decades of disinvestment, right? If the lack of access to capital and investments in these communities, the allowance of slumlords to get away with stuff that would never fly in other parts of town, and the disinvestment in schools, and the impact that all that has in provoking the exodus of professionals and families of color who then have the means and go to the suburbs because they can afford something better, but it leaves this hole in these neighborhoods. So if disinvestment is the technical instrument, right, if it has to do with that sort of role of investing or not, we see ourselves as returning investment into the community. So we invest, number one, in people. So a lot of our early work for the first couple of years before a single thing came out of the ground was just investing in leadership development, capacity building, neighborhood organizing work, teaching people how to do neighborhood organizing, doing what's called asset-based community development, where you don't focus on the distress and the lack, you focus on what people have, what skills, what knowledge, what experiences, what assets are in the neighborhood. And that really changes things. You're not asking people, what programs or services do you want? It's, what do you love about your neighborhood? What would you like to change about it? And maybe the most important question is, what are you willing to do about it? Now, that leads to more tumultuous conversations and people with strong opinions and agendas and all kinds of conflicting forces. But now you have the energy and leadership and voice of a community, so that 10 years from now, children talk about what happened there, not as, oh, some nonprofit came and saved our neighborhood, but my mom, my dad, my grandmama, they were part of something that turned our community around. And there were some folks who helped. Second is we invest in place. So we're now, in the last 5 years, we'll hit about $120 million of projects, from housing, senior housing, early learning centers, after school programs, healthcare centers, city parks, to really rebuild the bones of the neighborhood. So it's the kind of place we have people making six figures, walking around parks and really believing and seeing the momentum and vision for what's coming here in the future. And they live next door to someone who's using a public housing voucher to be in that unit. And then we invest in partnerships. And so to your point, the collaboration of bringing multiple partners together, I highly recommend a resource. Is an organization out of Atlanta called Purpose-Built Communities, currently funded by Warren Buffett, Tom Cousins, and Julian Robertsons. We became members of that network in 2015. There's about 23 of us now around the country doing work to apply this place-based approach that brings a collective impact around a community. Here's the big aha, is that poverty in every city is not equally distributed across a city. It's highly concentrated in a few neighborhoods. And most of the crime, dropouts, poor health, negative outcomes for the city are coming from those particular neighborhoods. And when you realize the injustice of that, you also see the opportunity that you get the more bang for your buck by focusing investments and developments in these few neighborhoods, and you make the entire city better instead of throwing money to the four winds in the name of philanthropy, which feels really good but doesn't actually move the needle. So that would be just some encouragement from that. And you can always feel free to just reach out to Purpose-Built Communities. And it's a free consulting firm if you had the guts to try to do something like this. And if you want to follow us, you can do that at liftorlando.org. Thank you. Thank you so much, man.
With that, I obviously want to respect everybody's time. We're right at 11, and these are certainly not issues that are going to be handled in a 45-minute conversation or discussion. And I know that while some of this intersects with real estate and what we do as a profession, as I talked about before on the definition of crises, short and long term, these issues are so much bigger than any of that. At the same point, and the last thing I'll say is, Eddie, you and I talked a little bit about, positional authority on Friday. My job as president of Carolina One certainly doesn't give me any greater understanding or right to sit up here in the center screen and talk to anyone than anyone else. But it does give me the opportunity to at least have this forum where we can have a conversation, kind of put things in the middle of the table, and maybe think about how, as we go about our professional lives, being able and having the privilege to bring home ownership to so many, that we can do that in a purposeful and driven way, focused on, as we've always talked about as a company, the goal of serving others, all others, and helping them realize the benefits of real estate, which is so much more than anyone really understands, and such a fabric of our society, and as Eddie helped us understand, our country as a whole. So Eddie, I thank you very much for being so generous and gracious with your time. I appreciate everyone being here and for all the nice comments. And I think everybody hopefully got a lot out of the conversation. All of these conversations are recorded. And so it is available on C1 Rose if someone wasn't able to attend, and I'm also going to forward out to everybody, and this will save me from sending less an email later, the link, so that not only can you watch it and you can fast forward through all the parts where I talk in the beginning, but you can also forward that link on to anyone else who might appreciate hearing about some of the ways in which real estate can at least play a small part in starting to address some of these bigger issues, and maybe that prevents them from being hidden under the rug or boiling over every couple years when we hear some news story or other things, and realize the difference really in short-term crisis and long-term problems that maybe we can do something about. So Eddie, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you in some format soon.
Hopefully.
And I appreciate everybody being here and hope you have a great rest of your week. So thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.